G'day folks, thought I'd run through a few things that I look over before I go on any trip. A few of the essentials just to ensure that they're okay, because it's a lot easier to top them up or fix something at home in the garage than it is to fix it out in the bush. So the first things I'll check, brake fluid over here. Just look in the reservoir, make sure that the brake fluid's between the maximum and minimum level. If it is down near minimum, doesn't mean that you've necessarily got a problem. Might just mean that your brake pads are wearing down, and it might be time to at least check your brake pads and see if that's the case. Over here we've got clutch fluid, same thing. Make sure the fluid's between maximum and minimum. It should never really vary unless you have a problem. So therefore, if it's varying, you better look into what's causing that. Power steering fluid, it's as simple as just popping the cap off, pulling out the dipstick, and there's a marker on the dipstick, tells you whether it's right or wrong, hot or cold. So just make sure it's within the respectable range. Washer fluid for the windscreen, I'll always make sure that that's full. You never know, usually if you go bush you're going to be cleaning the windscreen a fair bit, so that needs to be full. Now on the patrols, when you check your motor oil dipstick, it comes out on the active terminal every time. So that's why this rag lives in the car, and I just simply throw that over the terminal to insulate it, and I can pull the dipstick out without any worry in the world. Checking your motor oil is one of the most important. I check it before every trip that I go away on, and if the car's been running funny or anything like that while I've been away, I'll check it every day. You cannot risk running out of motor oil. Run out of motor oil, there goes your motor. So that's down a little bit. I'll top that up with a little bit of oil. I buy my oil in 20 litre drums. So I always keep a small container somewhere in the shed. It's a lot easier to pour a small container in than it is a big 20 litre drum. And besides, I take these little containers with me when I go into the bush, so if I need to top up or anything I can do that. So I'll just put about half a litre in, I suppose, and then I'll check it again. Probably not quite half a litre. Give it a little bit of time to flow down and settle in the sump before you check it on the dipstick. And that's much better. It's all good now. Moving around to this side of the engine bay, again, just check that nothing's vibrated loose. Batteries are something that can vibrate loose because they're a big, heavy item. On the patrols, this is my top of my radiator tank. Just check that that's full. And it is chockers. Then I have a radiator overflow tank in here. Check that's between maximum and minimum, which it is. That's no worries. Air filter. Air filters can get clogged up very easily if you've been doing a dusty trip or anything like that. So on the patrols, it's as simple as unclipping the lid and just whipping it out. And look, there's a few insects in that, and just brush those off. But this air filter is relatively new, so I expected it to be fairly clean. There's a couple of dead bugs in the bottom of the box, I can pull them out. When I go into the bush, I always carry a spare air filter anyway, If it's a really dusty trip or whatever, you can notice a loss of power in your vehicle if the air filter gets too dusty, so I always have a spare one in the back that I can swap out. Or if I know before I even leave home that it's going to be a dusty trip, I've got what's called a pre-air filter that goes on top of my snorkel, and it collects the majority of the large dust particles up at the top of the snorkel before it even gets to the air filter. When I run that, I do notice a slight loss of power, hence why I only have it on when I'm doing dusty trips. But that's purely because it restricts the airflow a little bit. That's why you have that little bit of a loss of power, but it does save your air filter from filling up with dust out on the tracks. So other than that, I just check that everything's tight. All my turbo pipes or intercooler pipes are all tight. There's no holes or damage to any of that's the air intake. That's all good. Nothing's loose. Everything's as it should be. And the main thing is to check all your fluid levels and things like that, and then check them when you get home. See if there's any change. If your fluid levels are down a little bit and you come home and they're still at the same level, it's not such an issue. But if you notice that something is full when you leave home and you come home and it's empty, well then that is an issue. You really need to find out where did all that fluid go, whether it's brake fluid or radiator fluid or whatever it is. It's about just taking notice of, have the levels changed, or are they the same as when I left home. So it's not so much about trying to find problems, but it's just keeping an eye on your motor and checking that nothing is changing. The next thing I check on my vehicle before a trip is my tyre pressures, just to ensure that they're all the same. I usually run these tyres at about 36 psi to go on a trip, and then obviously I drop them down when I'm in the bush to whatever the conditions require. But then at the end of the trip, when you pump them back up, because you've been driving on them, they'll be at all different temperatures. So therefore when you pump them up, you're not really getting an accurate reading of what pressure's in them. So when I get home the next day, after the tyres have all cooled down back to normal temperature, I then go around and check my tyres when I get home as well, and ensure that they're all the same, because 9 times out of 10 you will find they'll be all over the shop. They'll all be different. Another thing I always check while I'm checking the tyre pressures is the wheel nuts. I don't know why. Maybe someone can comment below this video clip if they know the answer, but the Patrols, for whatever reason, have a tendency for the wheel nuts on the rear passenger side to vibrate loose. Over the years, in my experience, I've lost 2 wheels off the other side, and it's purely just from the wheel nuts vibrating loose on that one particular wheel for some reason. So prior to every trip, I go around while I'm checking the tyre pressures and check all the wheel nuts. This is something that if I was out doing a week or 2 week long trip, I'd probably check them at least every second day. Corrugations and rough roads is all I can put it down to, is that causes them to vibrate loose. But for whatever reason on the Patrols, the rear passenger side wheel has a real tendency to vibrate loose prior to all the others for whatever reason. Now I wouldn't normally do this before every trip, but because my next trip is a competition, I'm going to go a little bit overboard and check all my diff oils. So the next one I'm checking is my rear diff here. So this here is the filler plug. So when you fill a diff with oil, the oil should fill up until it runs out that plug. So I'm going to take this out, and hopefully the oil is just there, just below the plug. So you simply undo the filler. Hopefully it doesn't come out. No oil coming out. I've got this nifty piece of wire that I simply put in, and yes, it's coming out with oil on it straight away. So I could even stick my finger in there, and yeah, the oil's right there. It's not milky or anything, it's perfectly fine. So that's that one checked. It's as simple as that. Just a tip for if you do service your own diffs and that, before you pull out the drain plug of the diff, you should always pull out the filler cap, because if you pull out the drain plug and drain all the oil out of your diff and then find that you can't open up this filler plug, then you're a little bit stuffed because you can't get oil back in it. So next time you drain your oils out of your diffs to change them, make sure you undo the filler plug first. That will ensure that you can get oil back in your diff after you've dropped all the oil out. Another thing I check while I'm under here is just the shockers. Make sure that they're not loose or anything. Have a bit of a look around, make sure there's no damage from the last trip and that none of the bolts or anything have come loose. So yeah, just give a pull or a shake on everything and make sure that nothing's loose. So here we are now at the front diff. It's very similar to the back one. Just undo the filler plug again. Have a rag in hand in case it comes dribbling out. No, it doesn't come out. Get my tool again. Just dip it in and should be just there below the filler plug, which it is, well and truly. There is no issues there. Again, I could see that it was all very clear, it wasn't milky or anything, so that means that no moisture has gotten in there. And then we just do it up. Doesn't take very long to check them. Normally though, if you haven't got oil leaking out your hubs or coming out of your diff breathers or anything like that, you really shouldn't have too much to worry about in your diffs. That's why I don't check them that often. So the next one I need to check is the gearbox. This is the filler plug up here. So again, it's the same old thing, 3/4 inch socket ratchet, and undo that. Again, have a rag on hand in case it makes a mess. And that one there is dribbling out, so that one's definitely full. I don't need to stick my little bit of wire in there. That's well and truly full, so that's no issue. Just do that one back up. On my particular gearbox, there is always a bit of a weepage dribble around them. Once again, it's like I said earlier, it doesn't really worry me. I just keep an eye on it. It doesn't get any worse. It's just the way it is from when I fill it. I just double check that they're all tight anyway, which they are. But yeah, for whatever reason my gearbox, I assume it's because it gets quite hot and then it cools down. It always has a bit of weepage around it, so I don't worry too much as long as it doesn't get any worse. After doing the gearbox, the next one that I need to do is the four-wheel drive transfer case, and its filler plugs up here. It's a little bit difficult to get to with a with just the socket ratchet, so I use a breaker bar just to get it started, and then the socket ratchet will fit in it well enough to undo it. It's just because there's a bit of a lip there in the casing. Makes it a little bit difficult to get to. Same thing, all of these should be full up to the filler caps. And yep, that one's the same, it's dribbling out all over me. So if it's dribbling out, it must be full. Have a bit of a look at the oil again, it's not milky or anything, so I've got nothing to worry about there. Just do it back up now, and that is all my diffs, gearbox, transfer, basically all the fluids underneath the vehicle have now been checked. Another thing I do while I'm crawling around under the vehicle, I don't do this very often, I only do it a couple times a year, but is grease all my grease nipples. it's just a matter of crawling around, finding them all and pumping a bit of grease into them. There's grease nipples on quite a few of the steering components, and then you'll find some more grease nipples on the drive shafts, on the tail shafts in the middle of the universal joints. They're probably the most important ones. So yeah, make sure you grease those at least once a year, or I usually do it when I come home from a really muddy trip where the car or the suspension has been submerged in some real sloppy mud. I pump grease into it then to force out any contaminants that have worked their way in. Another thing I do is I jot down everything I do to my vehicle in a logbook. Absolutely everything is in here from the day I bought the vehicle. I keep track of absolutely everything. Even when I do a pre-trip check like this, I'll write down that I checked all the diff oils and that I greased all the nipples and all that sort of thing. If something happens down the track, I know the last time that I checked everything and when everything was all good, and I can think about, you know, what went wrong between then and when an issue occurs. So there you have it, folks. They're the few things that I check over before every trip. Just like I said at the start, it's a lot easier to fix a few things in the shed than have to do it out on the tracks. So they're the things that I look at and check over before every trip. And then the diff oils and grease nipples and that, I do that a few times a year, but I've done it this time simply because I've got a competition coming up and I don't want anything to go wrong. So hopefully you might have learnt a couple of tips there, or a couple of things that you should check out before your next trip into the bush. Thanks guys.